get to follow the tribute to Jeannie, who's been an inspiration to me for many, many, many years. In his poem, Election Day, November 1884, Walt Whitman described what he called America's choosing day as the powerfulest scene and show in the Western world. More powerful, he wrote, than the huge rifts of canyons on the Colorado River or the spasmic geyser loops of Yellowstone. But even that celebrant of America's tumultuous, freewheeling democracy could not have imagined a quadrennial choosing with the rifts and spasms we've seen in 2024. Today, what I'm going to do with you is talk about some of the special pressures our election system faces this time around and how it's responding to them, and then leave some time for questions at the end. So let me start with a number of things that are different this time around that have changed since the last presidential election. The first of these, obviously, is even though we are often still masking up, we are not in the middle of the COVID crisis. The last time around, polling places were closed in many places. It was impossible to find poll workers in other places. People were scared to stand in line. There was a lot of confusion. People were afraid to go out. But one of the things that the COVID crisis also did was it hastened voting in non-traditional ways. People voting by mail, people dropping off their ballots in their cars. There was a 24-hour Harris County, Texas. You could drive through and drop off your ballot and the like. And so this time around, many people will continue to use those techniques that they had not used before that. Here in Santa Clara County, for example, you can vote by mail and you'll be receiving a ballot in the next couple of days if you're a registered voter here that you can return by mail. You can go to an early voting center, and those are going to open up, I think, in the county on the 26th of October. Or you can go on election day, which I always like because then you get your I voted sticker, and if you're lucky enough to vote near an elementary school or the like, you can also go to the bake sale while you're there. More than half of the ballots in the United States nationwide are going to be cast before election day this time around. And some of those ballots have already been cast, particularly by overseas and military voters under UOCAVA, where the ballots had to be sent out 45 days in advance so people can get them back in time. So that's one big change. Another big change is in every state there have been at least some changes to their election law since the 2020 election. Some of those changes make it much easier for people to vote. Some of those changes make it harder, but there are a lot of changes to election laws. One of the biggest changes, though, is not to the law, it's to who's running the elections. And here, it's worth understanding that 1/3 of the state election officials who operated the election in 2020 are no longer there. They've resigned or they've been replaced. Many of them resigned because of the pressure they were under in 2020. When I worked at the Department of Justice, I talked to a number of the folks who were running these elections, and some of them would begin to cry when they talked about the threats they'd received or the hassling they'd received, sometimes from outsiders, but sometimes actually from political actors themselves. And so there's going to be a lot less expertise in running the elections in some place than we had last time around. Another big change is the Electoral Count Reform Act. So we had a disastrous election in 1876. It took months to figure out who won, and ultimately the whole election was decided by a 15-member commission made up of justices of the Supreme Court and some legislators and the like. And it was so bad that 13 years later, Congress finally managed to act and pass what was called the Electoral Count Act. That was the act that was in effect in 2020, and it had a lot of confusing pieces to it. And so Congress has passed a new Election Count Reform Act that solves several of the problems that we saw from last time around. So for example, it clarifies that the electors in every state are supposed to be appointed, and here I'm going to quote from the act because actually what they're saying is important, in accordance with the laws of the state enacted prior to election day. In other words, states cannot wait until after the election and then change their rules. And you may remember that last time around there were some states where people were talking about maybe the state legislature could take the election back. Because there's actually nothing in the Constitution that requires popular election for the electors. That's just been what every state has done since 1880. 1876 was the last time a state appointed its electors. It was Colorado that did it because they were the centennial state. They didn't actually get into the Union in time to set up the election. But now you have to have the laws in effect before the election. You cannot wait and see and then change them. So that's a big and important change. A second big and important change is that this act sets out a bunch of hard dates for getting things certified in the state. And it makes clear that there's one official in every state who can certify the election. The state gets to pick who that is. So some states have picked the governor, some states have picked the Secretary of State, but that's the person whose certification counts. You can't have a bunch of other people certifying as well, and that makes a big difference. It changes, it creates an opportunity for the federal courts to resolve election disputes that involve the two presidential candidates. So those should move through the system faster. Then it increases the thresholds when the electoral votes get to Congress and they're opened on January 6th to be counted. It has upped the threshold for making objections, which is very important because last time around, if you had one senator and one member of the House who said, I object to what that state's, to counting that state, that was enough to send everybody out. You may remember they all, like all the senators go back to the Senate chamber and the House members stay, and then they're supposed to argue about it for a while and then come back together. Now you need 1/5 of the members of both of the houses to get to even have a discussion. And finally, it makes it clear that the vice president is there to gavel and do nothing else. The vice president is, to use a technical term, a potted plant. That is, the vice president does not have the authority to say, I'm going to count this state's votes and not this state's votes. So that matters because you'll remember the last time around there was all this claiming that Vice President Pence could just decide he wasn't going to count some states' votes. That's no longer part of the law. So those are the changes, and I'll just note one big uncertainty here, two big uncertainties here that it leaves up in the air. One is the constitutionality of all of this. You can imagine somebody challenging it. I don't think they're likely to win. And the second is that there's some issues that the act doesn't directly address. Like what happens if a state doesn't get its certification in on time? Can it turn in a late certification and have that certification counted? So that's a big change. The last big change I want to mention is that there's been a decline in public confidence. There's been a decline in public confidence in the election system itself. So among Republican voters, only 22% have a great deal of confidence in the integrity of the election system. There's been a decline in, there's been worry. The affiliates of the two parties tend to have inverse worries. So Republicans worry a great deal about election fraud and not at all about vote suppression. Democrats worry a great deal about vote suppression and not very much about election fraud. And both groups of voters are worried about whether the losing candidate will accept the results of the election. Up until now, we've always had, people giving their concession speeches the minute things were clear. Not clear whether that'll happen this time around. And on top of that, the Annenberg Public Policy Center has done polling of the confidence of Americans in the judicial system, which is likely to face a number of cases. There are already more than 100 cases that have been filed somewhere in the country that involve something to do with the 2024 election, and there are likely to be additional cases. Public trust in the judicial branch has fallen from 75% in 2000, and you'll remember that was a very tight election. It was decided, some people say by 535 votes in Florida, other people say by 1 vote in Washington. But that election, 75% of people had confidence in the Supreme Court. Now confidence in the judicial branch is below 50%, with confidence in the Supreme Court being even lower than that. And a majority of Americans believe that judges won't set aside their personal political beliefs when they make rulings, which leads to something that I will say at the very end of my talk about the famous election administrator's prayer. So keep that in your mind. So now let me turn to the kinds of problems that are worrying election observers and election officials, and talk a little bit about what might or might not happen in various places. The changes of the law, the influx of new voting officials and new voters means that there may well be a fair amount of confusion at various points, and that can play out in a variety of ways. So I'm going to talk first about, before Election Day, then I'll talk a little bit about on Election Day, then I'll talk a little bit about after Election Day. So before Election Day, lots of people are going to be voting. And this is good in one way because we'll get an early warning if things seem to be having deep problems. But there can be a lot of problems with early voting, particularly vote by mail voting. There can be postal problems. There are problems with drop boxes in some places. You may have read about the mayor of Wausau, Wisconsin, seizing the drop box that was right outside City Hall and taking it into his office. It's now back. And he says the only problem was it wasn't sufficiently anchored to the ground, and that worried him. So it's now like anchored to something, and it should be fine. But there are those sorts of questions about making sure that the boxes are secured and where they are and the like. There are technical issues when ballots are returned by mail. In some places they have to do signature matches. So they match the signature of the voter at the time the voter registered with the signature that's on the outside ballot envelope. Lots of people's signatures change over time, and that can be a difference. There are a bunch of states that are requiring various information on the ballot envelope provided by the voter, and if it's not correct, there's this question of what to do about it if it is not material to whether the person's entitled to vote. So, for example, there's been recent litigation in Pennsylvania because under Pennsylvania state law, election officials are required to reject ballots that are incorrectly dated, even if the ballot arrives long before Election Day. There's going to be federal litigation about this as well under something called the materiality provision of the Voting Rights Act, which says you can't reject a vote for reasons that are not material to the person's qualification. But it's not entirely clear what will happen with those. There are deadlines for returning vote by mail ballots, and these vary across the country. So most states require them to be back by Election Day. But some states, as long as they're postmarked by Election Day, they can come in a lot later. And those of you who voted in California may know we have 21 days. As long as the ballot was sent before, it can be counted, which is why, for example, some of the very tight races in California, down ballot races, weren't called until 3 weeks after the election because they had to wait for all the ballots to come back. There are some other states that have other deadlines like this. Obviously for the presidential election, it's not going to matter in California, that 21 days. But Nevada, which is one of the battleground states, has until November 9th to get ballots back. So as you'll see in a moment, I'll talk about, are we going to know on election night, and what does that do to public feelings about the election? There are also different state rules about how to cure a ballot that's defective when it comes in. So in some states, the requirement is that the registrar notify the voter that something's gone wrong with the ballot and give the person an opportunity to come in and cure the ballot. In other states, they don't notify people. They just don't count the ballot. How you cure the ballot differs from place to place. And so these rules are very state specific. And one thing to understand is in lots of parts of the country, the state has devolved all of this responsibility down to the county level, or indeed in a couple of Midwestern places to the township level. So there are thousands of election officials around the country administering this election. Perhaps as big an issue as all of the things I've been talking about before in terms of public confidence with vote by mail is what's referred to by some people as the ban on pre-processing. So in most states, and I think this is true in California, when a ballot comes back by mail, the outer envelope, which has the identifying stuff on it, is opened, the ballot is taken out, the ballot is then pre-processed, so it is ready to feed into the machine the minute the polls close. But Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, among battleground states, and also some other states like New Hampshire, which are not particularly battleground states, have a ban on pre-processing. So those envelopes cannot be opened, and those ballots cannot be put into the queue to be counted until the polls close, which means that it can take a while to get those ballots ready and in, rather than having the tabulation go boom, 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 boom. So those are the people voting before Election Day. What about the people voting on Election Day? I am not particularly worried about a lot of voter interference in a lot of places, but there's likely to be some, and it's likely to be magnified in various ways in the media that may cause confidence problems for voters in other places. There may be some misleading, targeted misleading information given to voters. For example, the last time around there was stuff telling voters in some places, your precinct votes on Wednesday, not on Tuesday, or robocalls, or the like on that. And that may have some effect on election day. There may be poll worker shortages in some parts of the country. They are trying to recruit poll workers, but they haven't necessarily gotten enough poll workers in a lot of places. That can lead to long lines and the like. And then I just want to mention one more thing about this, which is provisional ballots. The Help America Vote Act of 2001 essentially requires every polling place to give you a ballot when you show up. Even if your name is not on the list, you'll be given what's called a provisional ballot, and you can cast your votes on the provisional ballot. That every state has different rules about whether and when it will count these provisional ballots. So in some places, they have what's sometimes referred to as the right church, wrong pew rule, which is they look at your ballot and if you went to the wrong polling place, and lots of people do this because polling places are changed. In some places, they're changed every election. I represented voters in a case in Arkansas many years ago where in a 2-year period they had 10 different polling places for the majority black precinct. One of those polling places outside of the precinct and across a highway. If they could have put it across the river in Mississippi, they would have done that. That seemed excessive even for them. So what happens is people show up at the wrong polling place. And in a state that has a good right church, wrong pew rule, they will figure out which offices you were entitled to vote for, and they will count those votes even if you went to the wrong place. So your vote for president will certainly count, your vote for senator will certainly count, your vote for governor will count. If you're still in the same congressional district, that'll count, but maybe your school board member or your city council member won't because you voted in the wrong city or the wrong district or the like. But in other places, if you didn't go to the right place, they won't count your vote at all. And that can be especially problematic if there are 2 or 3 different precincts voting in the same building and you got in the wrong line. Then again, there are all of those rules about how do you cure your ballot if you went to the wrong place. A lot of places you have 7 days and you have to show up at the registrar's office to cure, which can be very difficult. And there are groups out there getting ready to help people with curing their ballots in various places. Okay, after the polls close, what's going to happen? Well, one thing that's going to happen is it may take time to get a clear result. It may take time in individual states, and on top of that, obviously, that may have effects on the national election. Because some of the states have much slower counting. One of the things that's changed in Santa Clara County is the ballots are now being counted where they're being cast, instead of having to be trucked to a central place to count. And so that's going to be more efficient. Some people are worried about the cyber issues on election night with getting the results reported back to central places, because that's a place where there's at least a little bit of worry. But what's going to happen if this election is like past elections is there are going to be what are called mirages and waves. The mirages, it looks like one candidate is ahead, but they're not really ahead because all of the votes haven't been counted yet. And as the ballots come in, that can change the results kind of dramatically, especially in places where people who support one party or the other are more likely to be voting by mail or not. And that differs in different parts of the country. There's a worry, and I think this is a real worry, although it may turn out not to be deeply problematic, about whether certain election officials will refuse to certify the election in their county. So far, 35 election officials, local election officials, since 2020, including in places like Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, have refused to certify on essentially local elections. All of them have been forced ultimately to certify by the courts. And there are provisions for forcing them to certify, but that may lead to some confusion on election night. It's also the case in many places that there are automatic recounts if the votes the margin of victory for one candidate or the other is less than 1%. In some places it's less than 0.5%, but that can require things. And then you may have heard about what's happening in Georgia, which is the Georgia Board of Elections has required a hand count of all of the ballots in Georgia before they go into the machine. The hand count is not going to figure out who won and who lost. They're just trying to figure out, is it the same number of ballots as the machines are counting? And the problem is hand counts are notoriously prone to small errors. And so there's now a huge lawsuit going on in Georgia. The Georgia Attorney General, by the way, told the Board of Elections, this is a really bad idea. We don't think you have the power to do this, but they went ahead and did it anyway. And so there's going to be a lot of litigation over that and a lot of other litigation. But now let me leave you with some good news. The good news is that well over 95% of the voters everywhere in the country who turn out to vote are going to have no trouble, if they're registered voters, casting a ballot and having that ballot counted. Lots of people will breeze into their polling place and breeze out again with their I voted sticker, and there's going to be no problem. The early voting experience is going to give us some sense of whether there are problems going on. State officials in the battleground states are well advised about their state laws. They are well prepared. There are lots of conversations going on with those elected officials to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And lastly, 98% of the votes in this country are going to be cast on paper ballots. And so there's not going to be the problem of machines malfunctioning with the ballots themselves. There may be malfunctions with the counting machines, but you can always go back and deal with those. So you'll remember I told you to think about the election official's prayer, and the election administrator's prayer is, Lord, let this election not be close. And the reason for that is you want the margins of error, which are always there, to be less than the margin of victory for a particular candidate in each election. With that, I'm glad to take some questions. All right. Are you going to take the...
Yeah.
I'll take that and bring it back, because we only have one mic.
You talked about 98% of the votes will be cast on paper. Is that, I remember all the discussion of the Dominion voting machines and all that stuff. What was the percentage